Great. So welcome everyone. I'm pleased to be here today. My name is Sonia Lee. I'm the director of the Canada Climate Law Initiative. I'm here with our distinguished panel to discuss cultivating effective climate governance, what small farm corporations in Canada need to know. So before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to acknowledge that CCLI is situated in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Musqueam people. And today I'm calling from the unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. The people of Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation have lived and nurtured on this land for millennia. So today I'm joined by Margot Ilbert, who's the author of the guide and professor at the Johnson Chioma Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Regina. Amr Aras, who's the Senior Director of Sustainable Finance and Insight at Farm Credit Canada, and Itoshi Shakma, Climate Solution Consultant, Climate Risk and Resilience at the Center for Climate and Business Solution at UBC Sauder. So today we're here to discuss the guide that we have published a few months ago, and we would encourage all participants to use the Q&A function to ask your question. We will have time at the end to answer your question. So we're going to start right away. And so my first question, and I'd be pleased to hear your perspective, Ito, Margot, Amr, on how agricultural producers have long managed and adapted to variable weather and changing climate. So why are we discussing basically climate risk here today? And Margot, Ito, apologies, if you would like to kickstart the reflection.
Sure. Thank you, Sonia. So climate risks, especially, I guess, physical risks and the uncertainties around it add to the difficulties of running a business today, especially if you're in a high-risk sector such as agriculture. However, it is also a known unknown, which means it is really hard to pinpoint its impact. It is really hard to predict and assess your own exposure to it as well, which can make it seem more distant. And as a result, it is easy to discount these risks, especially for your business. But as we all know, climate risks has been increasing rapidly. The frequency and intensity of natural disasters has been just like evolving and increasing rapidly as well. So it is really time right now to be very proactive about it, and rather than being reactive or like relying on the reactive practices of the past. Secondly, these physical risks translate easily to financial impact. For example, if you went to a local British Columbia grocer this summer, you would not have found any stone fruits in the store shelves because an unprecedented January deep freeze decimated 90% of the production. And it also resulted in $180 million of insured damages across Western Canada. So this just is an example of how these unprecedented events have very real financial impact on businesses. And lastly, I mean, we all know of global top line numbers of, let's say, $5.5 trillion of cost to Canada itself over this century, or $43 trillion of value at risk over this century globally as well. However, there is, I think, lots of work that can be done to situate these numbers for the local, for the smaller farmers, for the smaller businesses across Canada. And that is where at the UBC Climate Center, we have been wrestling with to try and see how we can help these small businesses who have less resources than the biggest corporations to really try and assess their own exposure to it and prepare for it as well. So there's a lots of work that needs to be done in this sector as well, in this segment, especially. Thank you.
Thanks, Ito. So you kind of like talk about climate physical risk, and Margot, would you like to expand on the transition risk that farms face? You're on mute.
Thanks. Yes, Hito did a great job talking about and giving some great examples of the climate risk. And I'm in the prairies here, and the farmers for a century and more have been managing risks of drought and also flooding here in the prairies. But with climate change, we see bigger events of rainfall, like more rainfall, more heavy precipitation events happening, which changes the landscape of farming somewhat and drainage. As well, droughts. We've been in a 5-year drought in the prairies, and farmers have done a great job adapting to increasing aridity and increasing less moisture in their soil and having to change their practices for this. So they've really done a good job. But when we talk about transition risks, we're talking about more than just the physical. We're talking about the changing policy landscape and what that means with changing governments, both in the United States and perhaps in Canada, what change in policy means to agricultural producers and the attenuating risks that come from that. The playing field globally, where agricultural producers from Saskatchewan and other areas of Canada sell their products, is changing, and that changes the risk for agricultural producers. Operationally, farmers are changing their practices as natural gas is being eliminated from power production and any type of heating. This changes technology and has implications which farmers have been bearing some of the brunt for, but it drives innovation, finding new and different technology. What we have seen globally, but not yet in Canada, from a legal perspective, is rising climate litigation, where increasingly groups of people or think tanks, etc., are raising the flag about the potential for damages through climate-related litigation, and definitely in respect of oil-producing companies such as Shell. There have been cases, but we're also seeing in New Zealand some cases that extend to dairy farms. So there's a potential that this type of litigation does come into Canada eventually through public interest claims, etc. And we do have some younger generations starting to commence claims in respect of climate change, holding some of us older generations and our associated businesses and industries accountable for that. So the landscape is changing, and we are calling that transition risk. We also saw a greenwashing bill pass in the federal government, which has had cascading impacts throughout not just agricultural land, but through businesses and will impact agriculture, where we as producers need to be very careful about the claims we're making about our products and their relationship to climate adaptation or climate mitigation, because the fines that are accorded by that greenwashing act are substantial. So transition risk in relation to climate is really about a whole suite of changes that are happening.
Thanks, Margot, for sharing. And I would really encourage people in the audience to read the guide. I think the litigation piece and the New Zealand case that you brought up in the guide is very interesting. And so Amra, I'd be keen to hear your perspective on like why are we talking about climate risk in the ag sector?
Sure, thank you, Sonia Lee. So great points from both Hito and Margot. I'll add just a couple of points. I think the key word to emphasize here is unprecedented, right? Naturally, farmers are close to the land, right? They're the best stewards of the land and the environment, so they understand their land. They understand the needs and stresses that it may come under. But really, what we're living through now, and according to scientists, are likely to continue living through for the rest of our lives, are unprecedented developments, right? How many 1 in 100-year storms have we seen in the last 5 years? So at some point we need to recalibrate and recognize that what we're facing is not the former natural cycle of a few years of drought, then you get better conditions and so on. We're in a secular change, right? Where the land is changing. In some ways, that may be beneficial. In some cases, for example, having longer growing seasons in Canada, 1 or 2 weeks extra of growing seasons would be helpful for certain producers. Probably we'll get better wines for all of us, right? We'll get the better quality grapes. But of course, that the physical risk that is associated with that change in the climate far exceeds any of the potential benefits that we will see. So I think that's one of the reasons we're talking about this today. The unprecedented scale, magnitude, and frequency, and also the growing awareness of the interaction between climate and biodiversity, and the growing focus on nature positive solutions, and learning some of the practices that have actually been around for many decades or centuries, even from indigenous peoples, for example, fighting wildfires and so on. So I think there's growing awareness of these issues. And then I'll just add on transition risk. There are some major developments that producers are facing, and regardless of who's in power in Ottawa or in Washington. The downstream, the distribution chain, their customers, right? Be it the distributors, be it the food producers, have all made quite significant sustainability related commitments, be it decarbonization, at the very least requesting disclosure and information, which many producers are not equipped to provide. And then you see the more regulatory developments, as Morgan mentioned. And I'll just mention one example, maybe that maybe some may be aware of. Denmark recently imposed €100 tax on cows, which for now remains confined to Denmark. Denmark, of course, is part of the European Union, which the European Union has a carbon border tax adjustment mechanism coming into force within the next couple of years. Should Canada not have a sufficient carbon price in place, or not have a carbon price at all, which may be a possibility, that will certainly affect all exporters to the European Union, including Canadian exporters. And of course, then the positive side of all that is the potential to tell the positive story, the success story of Canadian agriculture, in that it compares quite favorably to other jurisdictions when it comes to certain metrics. And maybe I'll come back and touch on that in a later part of the conversation.
Thanks, Amar, for that. I think it was all of you brought a great perspective and kind of like put the foundation in terms of like why we're talking about this. And so now I'm going to turn my attention to Margot. So the number of large Canadian farm corporations have increased in the past 2 decades due to the consolidation of many small farm and aging of farm operation. So large farm corporations have more resources and capacity than smaller one. However, small farm corporation and their corporate directors, so their boards and senior management, still have to oversee climate-related risks. So what are the legal duties do directors of Canadian ag corporation have in regard to the risk that we just discussed? And is there a difference between the duties of directors of small corporation farm versus large one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. And I'll wade in, and maybe Amar and Hito can come in as well, especially on the large versus small question. But in Canadian law, directors of corporations have these legal obligations to exercise the care and due diligence when they perform their duties as directors. And I know in a lot of small farming corporations, especially family ones, we don't really think about these things because they're filed off in the lawyer's office, et cetera, and we're running a family farm. But practicing law for 2 decades, I know in family farming that sometimes we do have family breakups, we do have new marriages and next generation farming with cousins, etc. And we do have family conflict. And that gives rise to the potential that someone as a director may no longer be my spouse, but may be a more distant relative, or in a farm corporation where we're not relatives, we are in a full-on corporate relationship without the family ties. So the law doesn't make a distinction that this is family and it should be different. When we're a corporation, the legal obligation and the standards and care of that director are the same when we create a corporation, so to speak. So this obligation to exercise care and due diligence exists regardless of the size, regardless of the type, regardless of the who or whom are in these positions. So the directors with this obligation have to make reasonable decisions given the socioeconomic conditions that are prevailing. And climate change is real, it's happening, and we're the cause. And we in power production and oil and gas in the prairies are very clearly aware of this obligation, and not always convinced that as farmers that we're thinking about the changes and the risks that we're talking about here today, and the opportunities as well. So it's an obligation in Canadian law, which is pointed out in the guide, to know these risks and these opportunities, because if we miss an opportunity, we miss revenue for our corporation. So meeting this standard of care becomes essential for directors of a corporation, and making sure, if you are a director, that you're exercising that degree and standard of care is so important. What I see too happening is large agricultural producers and large corporations are really getting climate change risk and transition risk and financial disclosures around climate correct. And they're really making change in this, which sets the bar higher of what we expect as reasonable activity in relation to climate and the risk. So we're not able, regardless of the size of farm that we are, to stick our head in the sand and pretend that we that this isn't happening around us, and to think about the broader implications. So I hope that helped. Any questions are welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Margot. I think that's very helpful. And then later on, we'll discuss about, now that you understand you have legal duties to oversee these climate-related risks, like what you actually can do from a governance perspective. But I'd be curious to hear if Amar and Ito, you have any reflection that you would like to share on this piece, and maybe like the distinction between the small and large corporation farm.
Sure, I can jump in quickly just to add briefly to what Margot said. I think you really have to start by looking at what is a director's fiduciary responsibility. And in a very simple sense, it is to identify material risks and opportunities, right? So climate change, it's difficult to argue that it is not a material risk, and it does certainly present opportunities as well. And so at a very basic level, directors have a fiduciary duty to identify those material risks and to hold the management of the corporation to account in making sure that there is a governance process in place for these types of risks, that it's incorporated into the strategy, into risk management of the firm, and that any necessary metrics and targets are set in place, which is kind of the structure, if you might know, of the climate reporting standards that have increasingly been adopted globally, and that companies, regardless of size, really are expected and will have no choice. In some cases are required, in other cases will be asked by their customers or financial institutions to adhere to and to provide information on. So I think that's really where it comes from, is that it's not something that we have a choice to not recognize and deal with, right? So doing nothing is not a solution. It's not going to make it easier.
Thanks, Amar. Ito?
Yeah, just to add, Amir mentions this already as well. So reporting standards are increasing globally, in Canada as well. And that is an exercise that we undertook over the summer as well, to look at how large corporations in British Columbia are reporting on their climate risks as well. So yeah, like as Margot mentions as well, this is like these regulatory policy environment and the disruptions around it are also an opportunity for opportunity, I guess. These are not just risks, but those who handle these effectively will reap better benefits in the future, and these would make Canadian farms, not just the large ones, but also the small ones as well, more competitive globally. And that is actually where we do need to focus on the upside, rather than, hey, is it a burden? it's not. It's not. It's a tool, effective tool for us to actually make sure that these like effects that seem so distant are real right now, so we can act on it very quickly.
Thank you for sharing that perspective, and it's a good segue to my next question. So, about the opportunity side of things. So, as Margot mentioned, directors have a duty to oversee the climate-related risk, but also the opportunity side of climate change and in the ag sector. So, Amr, so we've heard about some of the risks of the ag. There are opportunities to adopt and increase sustainable management practices, potentially save money and increase resilience. Could you speak to some of the opportunities you are seeing Farm Credit Canada customer seizing in regards to sustainability and biodiversity practices that you mentioned a little bit earlier? And how can the board think about climate risk and opportunities through the lens of financing?
Sure. Yeah. So this is the more exciting part instead of the doom and gloom, right? So the risks are real and are there, but certainly, whenever you look at any risk in general, that tends to open the door for opportunities. And at Farm Credit, we're in the process of finalizing a sustainable finance framework that informs financing and both financial and non-financial solutions in order to exploit some of these opportunities. And it really starts with telling the Canadian ag story and really the success of how Canadian agriculture, for example, one of the metrics on an emissions per pound or per bushel, depending on what we're referring to in terms of what crop or product, compares quite favorably. There was a study done by the Global Institute for Food Security in Regina that compares Canadian agriculture across the various agricultural sectors very favorably on an emissions basis to other jurisdictions, right? So that's one opportunity for us to exploit, which is to communicate that, right? To tell that success story. When we look at how we're going to roll out the sustainable finance framework at Farm Credit, we see that our customers, first of all, have already adopted many BMPs or beneficial management practices and expect not to be talked down to and kind of told what to do, right? They're very aware of, as I mentioned earlier, of the land and the best practices that work best for their farms. I'll give you just a few examples. No-till agriculture has been standard for quite some time, in particular in Western Canada, right? So not tilling the soil keeps more carbon and prevents loss of carbon in the soil and keeps the quality of the soil. Building up organic matter, robust crop rotations and intercropping are examples of favorable of BMPs that have been adopted by some of our customers. Increasing use of AI and leveraging of AI for things like key crop production decisions, lighting, irrigation, harvest timing, right? Artificial intelligence can really be leveraged, and there are some incredible opportunities in that space. I mentioned earlier wildlife corridors as a defense measure, adaptation to climate change, things like shelter beds, restoration of wetlands, again, all defensive measures. Precision agriculture using technology, GPS, variable rate application, drones, of course, all of these are also very useful in managing a farm. Infrastructure upgrades in general, data, collecting data and understanding how to leverage and use that data in order to have, for example, early warning indicators, weather forecasting, things that are really interesting, like instead of recycling, upcycling, right? So cattle upcycling, which is good for the environment and for food security. That's another aspect of opportunity that Canadian agriculture has to address the glaring food security problem that exists at a global scale, right? So feeding livestock food by product, right? They eat French fries, for example. And then, of course, one of the growing areas in Canada is our greenhouses. So finding ways to grow fresh produce year-round in Canada with controlled environment agriculture, be it greenhouses, vertical farming, and so on. All of these are examples, and I have more. But I think that's just kind of more of the positive side of what we're looking at as opportunities in Canadian agriculture.
Thanks, Aaron. I think you provided many great example, and I do like your point about like the looking at the success stories of the Canadian ag sector. Margot, would you like to add anything regarding the opportunity side?
Yeah, no, a great list of Amer, and it is an opportunity. In some cases, it's a missed opportunity. So we did go to no-till in the prairies here decades ago, but we have done it because it's efficient and profitable. So we measure it because of that. We've measured the impact of it around profitability and efficiency. What we did not do is document well the storage of carbon in our soil and the increased storage of carbon over these 2 decades in the soil. So in order to get a benefit for, or a credit for climate action in a policy realm, we need to be able to measure, verify, and report this type of thing. So if there's something I would point out is we need to think not only about all of the benefits we've received in changing crop rotations and in min-till or direct till, but we need to measure it in relation to climate change so that we can seize the opportunity to point out to the world and get credit for that activity. And this, I think, for agriculture is a missed opportunity.
Thanks, Margot. And Ito, do you have anything you'd like to share about the opportunity side? Maybe some example and that you've seen in BC?
So, for example, the BC provincial government has done a great job at making available resources for small farmers or agriculture producers out there. And I think in our discussion with them, what we found that they are also looking for ways to distribute these resources, and we're not sure if these resources are reaching effectively the end audience that it is intended for. So definitely, I guess financiers could have a role here. So, for example, we engage with a farmers market, and they could be a conduit for some of these resources to these producers out there, and financiers could be another way that some of these like trusted and well-researched resources are going to these agriculture producers out there who need it the most. So yeah.
Thank you. I will ask my last question, but before I do ask the last question and go to the Q&A period, I would like to remind everyone that there is a Q&A function. Please do use it and ask your question, and then we'll have time at the end to answer your question. So my last question is to all of you, and then maybe I can start with Margot. So we talk about the climate risk, the opportunity side of the coin, and also how boards have legal duties and senior management have legal duties to oversee these risks. But concretely, from a governance perspective, how do board and senior management of ag creation do that? And Margot, keen to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, and I hate to sound like the university professor here, but it's almost like, could you as a director pass the test? Could you actually describe climate change impacts and the risks and what the corporation's doing to address those challenges? So do you have your elevator speech ready? And then I don't want to make you crazy, but increasingly, where we in the climate change world and in the financial disclosure of large corporations listed on stock exchanges are looking for a strategy that aligns with climate scenarios. And these climate scenarios require emission reductions. So how does a corporation fit into those Canadian stated targets of emission reductions and the Paris commitments made internationally? And what is the actual corporation's climate risk strategy? Could you actually point to a document or at least give a summary of what the corporation's risk strategy is in relation to climate scenarios? So if that all sounds like Greek, then probably a little bit more work needs to be done learning about these things. And they're not difficult. The guide has basic information in it to start people on their way. thinking about these, and some questions in appendices as well. To like directors in a traditional corporation, directors would come to a directors meeting and ask of the executives. So even though we might not have the same formal meetings and structures going on at the agricultural, smaller agricultural corporations, the same expectations are in law expected of these directors. And considering the international supply chain that a producer's selling into and what the implications are. So one thing that we have not discussed that will be coming at us, in addition to the border adjustments that Emmer raised in relation to the European Union, where if we lose our carbon tax, the European Union will put a border adjustment tax on us, and that money will go to the European Union as opposed to a carbon tax, which goes to the Canadian government. So there's a geopolitical tension ongoing there. But we also need to consider some supply chain issues that we haven't talked about. One being dairy and the lost or waste product that happens in our supply chain, specific to dairy production and specific to bread, where the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, in its land and climate report, and then in its more recent reports in AR6, has identified food waste as one of the biggest contributors to emissions, in the sense that they're emissions that are created and generated and they go nowhere. So we need to start thinking about our place in that supply chain, because if an adjustment goes on at the producer or at the distributor or the food processor side, it's still going to have implications along up and down that food supply chain. And these types of things in the future will be increasingly studied.
Thanks, Margot. I think you brought up a very good point, and I will mention that in the guide, we appreciate that farmers are super busy, so we also created an exact summary that kind of like condense all this information, because as you mentioned, if it's all sounds Greek to you, maybe there's some sort of like learning to do, and the question or a good start to have your own reflection at the board level, but also ask questions. Amer, would you like to add anything in terms of like the board perspective and the governance piece?
Sure, I'll start by plugging Margot's publication. I think that's a great place to start for any board, for any group of directors. There's some guidance, and I mean, look, we clearly all, I mean, anyone who understands this space and has been following sustainability and evolution of disclosure standards and so on, will be very sensitive to the burden it places on reporting entities, right? Whether it's the farms or really all sectors, right? And regardless of size, even the bigger corporations struggle to collect and put the data together, and it requires Herculean effort, right? So we recognize that clearly, but it really is not just an exercise for the purpose of the exercise, but it sets the organization up to understand its own exposure to these risks and opportunities. And just like accounting, right? We have accounting standards. We have to document financial performance and track our financial performance. This is no less necessary. I would say also there are opportunities for us at Farm Credit. We're quite sensitive of what farmers need in terms of non-financial support as well, right? So we have a big focus on food waste. That's something that we're leveraging our resources as much as we can in order to address massive challenge globally. We also have advisory services where we work with outside entities and provide financial support in order to help customers deal with issues, including ESG issues and climate issues and so on, but also other challenges like access to capital for young farmers in particular, right? That's a challenge, and we know that there's going to be transition over the next decade or so where a large number of farmers are planning to retire, and that younger generation struggles to gain access. So a director should inform themselves about that and have succession planning in place And that's something that we support, and we provide support to consulting firms that will help customers with this kind of succession planning and transition. Be aware as well of other opportunities that are available. There are lots of grants, for example, from various entities, right? I was here in Quebec. There are grants for energy efficiency from Hydro-Quebec, for example, and they're quite significant in size. And yes, it's difficult to navigate the paperwork, so they will also provide support for managing the process and the paperwork. They just need to get in front of the farmer and to say, here's the program available to you, and this is what needs to be done in order to become eligible. On the agrivoltaics side, that's another huge area of opportunity of installing renewables and so on the farm. So be aware of opportunities, right? There are numerous sources available out there. There's a recent also development with the National Index on Agri-Food Performance from the Center for Agri-Food Benchmarking, which is a great place to start. If I'm a director on a farm corporation, I would look at that. It's a list of metrics that can be measured to assess Canadian agriculture and how its overall broad performance, both on the economic and on the sustainability front. And so that's a set of metrics you can start with if you're not sure what you should be looking at from a governance perspective. So just to summarize, there are lots of resources available, and I think reaching out and making the effort to find those resources, certainly reaching out to someone like Farm Credit, who has the mandate to not only provide funding for the industry and capital, but also to support the industry. And we're happy to work with any customer that reaches out in order to help them in this journey.
Thank you. I think it's good to hear. We've heard Margot talking about the resources in the guide itself, where we kind of like condense all this information. FCC has a lot of other resources other than financial capital, and also Ito, you mentioned BC particularly, but maybe your province also has multiple resources to help you think about climate risk and opportunities. So before I move on to the Q&A, Ito, I would just wanted to give you a chance. Would you have anything to add regarding the governance piece of managing and overseeing climate risk?
Great. Yeah, sure. So again, I guess going through the ag guide, what jumped out to me was the section on the questions that the farm directors can ask, for example, right? So these are really great questions that boil down really expansive topics into a couple of simple questions that could be a starting point for anybody who's overwhelmed with all these resources that are out there. Honestly, it could be quite a lot to tackle, and that is exactly what we try to do at the Climate Center as well. So utilizing reporting standards such as the TCFD as a starting guide, but the TCFD it's massive, and then how do you boil it down to a couple of simple questions under governance, let's say under risk management, under metrics, that could be a priority for someone just starting out. So I would really say that like at the bottom of the guide, we have those like simple questions that Margot put together, right? So those could be a really great starting point. And then from then onwards, you build complexity on top of it. And as you work towards these processes, these risk management processes, the governance processes, these are only not for reporting, but also, yes, it does reduce your own organization's risk as well, and it makes you more resilient. So these are like two birds in one stone, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you, Hammer, for putting the resources in the chat for all the audience. So now we're going to go into the questions. So we have a few questions in the Q&A chat, Q&A function, apologies. If you want to, please add your other question. So someone asked, we did touch upon this topic a little bit, but be keen to hear if you have anything else to add. So the title of this webinar is about governance. Farmers are already struggling with the impacts of climate change. How is paperwork and admin supposed to help farmer adapt? Seems like an added cost and stress with zero ROI. So I don't know if someone wants to tackle this question.
I guess I can go first, and Amer and Hito can come in. So yeah, added paperwork. I'm not sure that there has to be added paperwork in the sense that the questions a director would ask of themselves are questions to ask and to get answers for, but really administratively, the paperwork aspect of it and documentation, I guess we haven't really covered. So if a director can speak to these issues and answer the questions at the end of the guide, then as a lawyer, I would always want a director to document that the questions were asked at a meeting and answered. But those meetings of directors should be happening as per the legislation in any event. So I don't know as I see this as added paperwork. But I do see it as risk management for sure. And I apologize in the sense that, yes, this is yet another thing to be thinking about as an agricultural producer, conducting operations and producing grain. But we are in the 21st century and have long ago moved beyond simply producing grain, but having to market it and having to enter into the agribusiness world as agricultural producers here in the prairies in any event. So I'm not sure. I think it's consistent with that trend as opposed to something in addition or something extra, if that makes sense. And I know that doesn't make it better or make it go away, but it is, I guess, the world that we live in Canada and North America and in 2024.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Amr.
I would add to that also that I would look at this question in the broader context, right? Which is, what is the alternative? And the alternative is not cost free, right? I think what we often tend to disregard in the broader conversation about dealing with climate change is the cost of inaction, right? If we do nothing, it's not like everything is going to be great and we're, these problems will go away, right? This is a reality, as Margaret said, we're facing today in this world, in this time. And so, the guide that we're talking about here is a way to structure, right, to help to provide a framework for understanding the risks that an organization faces and potentially the opportunities in order to mitigate and deal with those risks. So it's not something that you can kind of turn your back on and walk away from, right? Because there is a cost to not doing it, and it will affect your business. And then if we're talking about the broader topic of disclosure requirements, which I alluded to earlier, which are a burden for sure on any reporting entity, it's not a choice either, right? And whether Canada, for example, has disclosure requirements as the European Union does or not, of course we don't, right? We, listed companies in Canada, Canadian securities administrators have not yet made any mandatory climate disclosures or put them in place, but Europe has it, California has it, a growing number of entities around the world have it. Canadian banks are subject to OSFI B15 disclosure requirements, which means they will be asking for this information from their customers. Listed companies in TSX, the big ones, at least TSX 60, vast majority there have sustainability reports for which they require information and data from their value chain. So it really is at a point today where it's not, this is a burden and I don't want to deal with it. It's how do I deal with this as efficiently as possible without placing an undue burden on myself.
Thank you for sharing that. Ito, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just very quickly. Absolutely agree with Amer. I mean, there are costs, but they seem distant. we are still not aware of what these costs may be. So I mean, the alternative to business as usual could be a little bit burdensome in the short run, but there could be benefits to be had in the long run. And I think it's quite encouraging that small farms are participating in these discussions and asking these questions, and that is how the feedback loop should work in order for us to get those feedback as well and make sure how the current resources and the process around it could be made more efficient and effective for the end users. So yeah.
Thanks. So we did address a bit the sustainability reporting requirement, and the next question is about that. And with more sustainability reporting requirement, and this is the question that we hear not only in the ag sector but also in all sectors, I would say. How are farmers navigating that data challenges and increasing cost of reporting? Anyone would like to answer that question?
I think Amer probably has the best deep look at this, having looked at farm books and banking records. But from a business perspective, the programs and apps I've seen that farmers use to calculate and plan their crops and the revenue from what they're going to seed and what they're going to produce is very high tech and very, very data driven, to the point, as I'm speaking to farmers, so I assume like our farm equipment's running on a field using GIS, and when it needs a part, it sends a text message to the supplier who brings it to the field. Like, we're living in a high technology world, and I'm not convinced all that technology benefit is accessed or distributed equitably to small versus large farmers. So that's something I don't know, but I do see this as something that the climate aspect and the climate risks as very easily built into these programs or these applications. But because and even from the questions in the chat, this is a high risk sector, agriculture. So adding another level is always cumbersome and burdensome. But really, as Amer says, there's a cost to not doing things. And as my example to direct till, farmers didn't receive any sort of economic compensation for doing really good practice for climate change in the environment. So we need to have our mindset in this area in order to make that opportunity, or to ensure that we don't have opportunities pass us by in the agricultural sector that we could have, should have, would have had. In relation to emissions, it's actually becoming easier, and the World Meteorological Organization that does all the climate change is starting to be able to ascertain what the emissions are coming from industry, the land, in actuality versus what countries are declaring their emissions are. So there's a layer of verification and reporting that's happening. So again, I think it behooves agricultural producers to become part of this discussion at this stage, and not coming into this discussion at the end of the stage when the opportunity is lost.
Thanks, Margot. I think you brought up very good. Amer, go ahead.
Oh, well, I've been reading the questions in the chat from Lindsay Smith, and I think it's kind of linked to this question. So I'd love to address those, because it's a great question. And yes, you're right, Lindsay, that no-till is an excellent example of ROI, and an activity that generates economic benefits. So I would say certainly it's a challenge for small farms, especially those like Lindsay's that are sort of doing all the right things for climate resilience and taking advantage of renewable energy and so on. So one of the things that we're aware at Farm Credit of these challenges, and so one of the things that we're planning on doing over the last few months, we have run a pilot project with a third party partner to provide advisory service to the agri-food and agribusiness sector, and we're looking now to expand that pilot to ag production, right? So this will be coming out in the next few months. and we'll make it available to any farmer, whether you're an FCC customer or not. I hope you are, but even if you're not, we're happy to provide that service. And what we do is we pay for an engagement with the customer on kind of an initial 5-hour engagement, which we cover 100% the cost of, to assess what the farmer needs in terms of addressing their sustainability issues. And then subsequent to that, we will also heavily subsidize any subsequent consultation up to a certain number of hours that may result out of that. And I think, to me, in my view, this is the optimal way by which some of those challenges can be addressed on how do I take advantage of having adopted BMPs. We can't make the market pay a premium for products. That's something that we would certainly love to see, but we haven't seen that at scale yet. Monetizing carbon sequestration in the soil is something that some producers have been doing, but again, we would love to see that scale up much more than it has. And we are, from our side, looking very closely at this and what we as FCC can do in order to help scale up access to voluntary carbon markets for farmers. We do have one of the things we've heard from surveys is that a lot of customers have adopted sustainable practices and just have not had the capacity to track those digitally, right? So we do have Ag Expert, which is a tool that's available for customers, and the data protection and governance that is put in Ag Expert is world class. It's extremely reliable and secure, and you don't have to worry about your data being abused or sort of being shared in a way that you would not desire. So I would say stay tuned, look at Ag Expert, because that's also one of the tools that we're looking to leverage at Farm Credit.
Thanks, Amr. And please, if there is a link, hyperlink, please put it in the chat so we can share it with the audience. So we only have a few minutes left, but maybe as a last question, it's a bit more of a broad question, but if someone would like to answer, we have 2 questions regarding food waste. And I think all of you have spoken a bit about the opportunities to reduce food waste. And someone asked, but 35.5 million tons of food are lost in Canada per year. How do we tackle this problem and feed BC shortcoming? So this is a very big question, less directly related to governance, but if someone would like to kind of like expand their reflection on this, super keen to close this webinar.
I'll go, and I hope somebody has a better answer. So the truth of it is, I don't know. So I was one of the coordinating lead authors in the IPCC Land and Climate and Food Wastage and remedies for that. We listed pretty much on the individual or the micro scale. And to me, that falls flat, because when you look at, as the Q&A pointed out, the amount of food wastage is very large. So from my interest in this area, I think it has to be at the macro, the supply chain level. So there are other industries that are very efficient and have been able to reduce the waste in their supply chains. So I think we have to look to that. And from what I have seen, from looking at it from a supply chain manner, it comes out not at the farm gate level, but comes out more at the either the processing level or the distribution level, and thinking about fixes along that chain and thinking about uses of waste in a way that doesn't put it in a landfill. And I think Amar and Hito talked about this, where we put certain byproducts of the agricultural food chain back into feeding livestock, etc. So certain amount of things are happening, but I personally think we really need to think through the milk and the bread, which just comes to me top of mind at this point. I'm sure there's others, and it's looking for those opportunities and the incentive that we could give people or businesses to make it an opportunity, not a regulatory pecuniary measure.
Thanks, Margo. Ito, Amar, any thoughts regarding food waste that you'd like to share?
That's the toughest question, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's really the first thing I would say is the solution should not be confined to looking at farms. You should look at the whole value chain, right? Because as Margot said, a lot of the waste happens in the production phase, agri-food, or in the distribution chain at grocery stores and restaurants and so on, and at home, right? I mean, the reality is this is something that we will not really be able to collectively address unless people also individually take some responsibility for food waste, right? And it's all you have to do is go to an open buffet and see how much food is wasted when people have access to unlimited quantities, right? So and I know there's nothing any of us here can do about this, so it kind of becomes a personal personal challenge, I guess, for everyone. But I think, yeah, I would say it's a tough challenge. We're certainly aware of it at Farm Credit and trying to see what we can do from our side to address it. But the key is to look at this across the value chain, from farm all the way to the landfill, and how we can reduce all the way along that value chain.
Thank you, Amar. Ito, any last word before we close this discussion?
Yeah, very quickly, absolutely agree with Margot and Amer. It's a problem larger than many of the problems at hand right now for globally. So that does need to be taken into account. And overall, I guess, lastly, just in terms of the Climate Center itself, we recognize there are gaps in terms of the resources available, especially for small businesses out there. And that is where we are trying to operate as well. So so this is something that we do need to focus on as a group, and really put our efforts together to make sure that these, like the smaller, the medium-sized farms, the businesses out there, do not fall behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Ito. I think you have finished this discussion with a very wise word, which are there are resources, and you've seen during this discussion a few resources either from CCLI, FCC, Center for Business Climate Solution. And at the end of this webinar, we will also share in the email all these resources. So keep an eye on these. We will share the links. This discussion was also recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel. So thank you so much to all of you for sharing your insight and perspective, and so for being brave enough to answer the very big challenge question about food waste. And I wish everyone a great rest of the day.
Thank you, and great
everybody.
job moderating, Sonia Lee.
Thank you.
Yeah, good job.
Bye-bye.
Sonia.